Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be examining the Russian revolutions of 1917 and also how communism was implemented in the Soviet Union. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video is first, how did the Bolsheviks gain power in the Russian revolutions? And second, how did Lenin and Stalin implement Marx's theory of communism in the Soviet Union? So just as a quick little refresher, last time we were in Russia was in the 19th century. You may recall from period 4 and into period 5, the dynasty that ruled Russia from 1613 to 1917 were the Romanovs. You had czars like Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. In the 1850s, Russia fought in a war against the Ottomans, and the Ottomans had the help of the French and the British. You might recall this was called the Crimean War, and the Russians were defeated. And as we saw a lot of in the 19th century, if you can't beat them, join them. And so we see Tsar Alexander II dictating some reforms, freeing the serfs, and encouraging more state-sponsored industrialization. Now, by the 1900s, the state-sponsored industrialization was taking place mostly in Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And you can imagine that working in Russian factories, no bueno. So these harsh working conditions caused many factory workers to gravitate towards Marxist socialism. Many of them began to riot and protest. And in 1905, the situation got so bad that the Tsar had to agree and accept some modest reforms. And so the Tsar formed a legislative body called the Duma, rather than just being an absolute ruler. The idea behind this was that there would be more popular participation in government. And ultimately, though, the Duma did not do much, and the Tsar began to reassume power following this revolution. So the first big question we should be able to answer is, how did the Bolsheviks gain power in the Russian Revolution of 1917? Now, Russia entered World War I in 1914 with the world's largest army. So just massive manpower. And yet, Russian industrialization had not progressed as far as other Western European nations like the British and the French and the Americans. And so you have stories of, for example, Russian troops having to ride bicycles out to the front lines in World War I, only to be mowed down because they simply didn't have the same industrial technology that Western powers like the Germans were fighting with. So by 1917, 3 years into the war, Russia was suffering. Russia was experiencing high levels of casualties. In fact, more Russians died in World War I than of any other nationality. There was a high number of mutinies, soldiers quitting in the middle of the battle. There were food shortages. And as a result, many Russian people were very unhappy with the way the war was progressing. The Tsar at the time was a Tsar named Nicholas II, and they were also upset with some of the things that he was doing. So, for example, his advisor...
I was once the most mystical man in all Russia.
If you've seen the movie Anastasia, you'll know this is Rasputin. Usually Disney over-dramatize and make the villains seem even scarier looking, but this is what Rasputin actually looked like in real life, so I think they actually made him less scary in the movie somehow. There's an interesting story about how Rasputin died. He was advising the Tsar Nicholas II. He was offering all kinds of pretty kind of mystical, crazy ideas. And so the wealthy aristocrats in Russia were not happy with this. They were kind of jealous of the power that Rasputin was wielding over Nicholas II. So they got together and conspired to assassinate Rasputin. Well, they invited him over for some cakes and tea, and they laced the cake and tea with some cyanide. And apparently this was not enough to kill Rasputin, so they then shot him. Something like 4 times, like one time like straight through the heart, but Rasputin did not die, or at least they didn't think that he was dead, and so they threw him into a cold frozen Russian river where he ultimately froze to death. In 1917 in February, the people were just simply fed up with the way the state was being run. And so protests ultimately will force Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate the throne, to step down, and this marks the end of the Romanov dynasty. So we've been seeing a number of large, long-lasting empires coming to an end at the very beginning of the 1900s. That would include the Ottomans, the Qing Chinese, and now we can add to that the Russians in the Romanov dynasty. Now, a provisional government assumed power. So they took the legislative body, the Duma, and they gave more power to it and tried to create a more democratic form of government. But ultimately, the people placed in power in Russia ignored popular demand. The one thing the people wanted was to get out of World War I. And the new democratic Russian government did not do this. So as you can imagine, the people continued to be upset. They continued to riot and protest. The people pushing for more radical change were people advocating for socialism, right? Groups like the Bolsheviks. They were the primary group that was demanding even more radical social change. Another group was the Petrograd Soviet. So at the time, St. Petersburg was known as Petrograd. The name was changed to Petrograd. And the Soviet was this organization of factory workers and soldiers. It was essentially like a kind of more glorified union. But the Soviets needed a leader. And so into this scenario, we have Vladimir Lenin appearing. So Vladimir Lenin was a Russian who had been exiled because his brother had attempted to assassinate one of the czars. He'd been exiled to Switzerland. He had been living in Switzerland when World War I breaks out, when this February Revolution takes place, and he says, I need to get back to Russia immediately. And so he seeks out and gets the help of the Germans, and the Germans smuggle Vladimir Lenin back into Russia. They put him into a train car, and it's all boarded up, and they smuggle that train car back into Russia. Now, this should not be a surprise to you that the Germans would want to introduce Vladimir Lenin back to Russia because they are fighting a war against Russia at the time, and they want to ultimately stir the pot. So when Vladimir Lenin shows up, he advocates for all power going to the Soviets, right? He is going to lead this socialist revolution, and he's suggesting that these factory workers should be the group that drives this revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, gain popular support by advocating for the things that the people in Russia want the most at the time. Their little slogan was peace, land, and bread, meaning what? People wanted to get out of the war, out of World War I. They want land because many of them were former freed serfs or factory workers who had very little wealth or property, and they were just simply hungry, and so they wanted bread as well. So Lenin leads another revolution in October of 1917. So the same year, there's two revolutions in Russia. This one will overthrow the provisional, more democratic government and place a Marxist socialist government in power. And this was a bloodless coup. Now in 1918, the Bolsheviks sign a treaty with Germany. So the Russians then drop out of World War I. From 1918 to 1921, a civil war breaks out in Russia between the Reds, the pro-communist forces led by the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, who were these wealthy landholders in Russia who were anti-communist. They don't want to see property redistributed. And they had the backing and support of Western nations like the United States, like Britain, like France, who were not at all interested in a new ideology taking hold in Russia. The Reds ultimately win this civil war, but in the process of having to take power and assume power in sort of a strong fashion, we're going to see this history of Bolshevik authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is just a very strong, powerful, centralized government, so very similar to almost what we saw under the Tsars, where there's not a lot of room for dissent or disagreement. So the name in 1921 is changed from Russia to the Soviet Union to reflect that power is shifting towards the Soviets, which again were these sort of union of factory workers in various Russian cities. So after watching this video, you should be able to explain how the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, gained power in the Russian revolutions of 1917. In the next video, we will be discussing how Lenin and Stalin implemented Marxist theory of communism in the Soviet Union. Thanks for watching.